Death Rides at Midnight by Ruben White. The last drops of sunset bled across the New Mexico sky like spilled wine on a barroom floor. Deputy Marshal Thomas Hawkins stood in the doorway of the Painted Lady Saloon, watching as Doc Simmons tended to old Pete's wounds. The elderly bartender's weathered face was a canvas of purple bruises, his right eye swollen shut like a storm cloud ready to burst. "They didn't have to do him like that," Hawk muttered, his fingers drumming against the pearl handle of his Colt. "Man's been pouring drinks in this town since before I was knee-high to a grasshopper." Sheriff Wilson grunted from his position by the bar, where he was examining the splintered remains of the cash box. "Ain't about what folks have to do, Hawk. Some men just got meanness in their blood, like rattlers got venom. The robbery had happened 3 nights ago, just as the moon was climbing over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. For men in black dusters, faces hidden behind red bandanas, had burst through the saloon doors like summer thunder. They'd taken everything, the night's earnings, Pete's personal savings, even the prized bottle of Kentucky bourbon that had been sitting behind the bar for nigh on 20 years. But what stuck in Hawk's craw wasn't just the theft. It was how the owner, Augustus Fleming, had responded by firing Pete the very next morning. Said he needed younger blood behind the bar, someone who could put up more of a fight if trouble came calling again. "Reckon I'll head out at first light," Hawk said, adjusting his hat. "Track's still fresh enough to follow, especially after that rain we had. They'll be headed toward Texas, I figure." Sheriff Wilson's face twisted like he'd bitten into something sour. "Might want to save yourself the trouble, son. Fleming's already hired some fancy Pinkerton man from back east. Says he don't trust local law to handle it proper." "That so?" Hawk's voice was soft as cotton, but his eyes had gone hard as flint. Something about this whole business smelled worse than a dead skunk in August. Fleming had never shown much concern for his money before, letting tabs run longer than a desert rattler. Why bring in outside help now? The next morning found Hawk in the saddle anyway, his blue roan mare picking her way through the scrubland as the sun crept over the horizon. He'd worked these lands for 15 years, knew every arroyo and box canyon like the lines on his own palm. More importantly, he knew the people, their habits, their histories, the secrets they thought were buried deeper than their kin. The tracks led north instead of east, away from Texas. Whoever had left them wasn't trying particularly hard to hide their passage, which made Hawk's neck prickle with suspicion. No outlaw worth his salt would be this careless unless they wanted to be followed. By midday, he'd reached the old Santiago silver mine, abandoned these past 5 years after the vein had run dry. Or at least, that's what everyone had been told. The tracks led straight to the mine's entrance, where fresh boot prints in the dust told their own story. Hawk dismounted, tied his mare to a scraggly mesquite, and drew his Colt. The mine's entrance yawned before him like the mouth of some great beast, cool air breathing out from its depths. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he noticed something odd. The support beams looked new, the timbers fresh cut and solid. Well, he whispered to himself. "Ain't you just full of surprises?" The tunnel stretched deeper into the earth, the air growing thick with the smell of damp stone and something else, tobacco smoke, fresh enough to still hang in the air. Hawk moved silent as a mountain lion, his boots making no sound on the packed earth floor. The passage twisted left, then right, before opening into a larger chamber lit by several oil lamps. The sight that greeted him stopped him cold. Stacked against one wall were crates marked with Chinese characters, their contents visible through broken slats, rifles, new enough to still smell of packing grease. Against another wall stood barrels bearing the stamp of the U.S. Army, and spread out on a rough wooden table was enough dynamite to turn the whole mountain into gravel. "Quite a cache you've found, Deputy Hawkins." The voice came from behind him, cultured and Eastern educated. Hawk turned slowly, his gun hand steady, to face a well-dressed man in a black suit who could only be Fleming's Pinkerton agent. But something in the man's stance told Hawk this was no detective. "Reckon you ain't actually with the Pinkertons," Hawk said quietly. The man smiled, thin as a razor's edge. "Very observant." "No, I represent other interests. Ones who would prefer this little discovery remain our secret." He gestured to someone behind Hawk. Mr. Fleming sends his regards." The blow came from behind, stars exploding in Hawk's vision as something hard connected with the back of his head. As consciousness faded, he heard the well-dressed man speaking again. "You see, Deputy, this was never about a simple robbery. The West is changing. There's a storm coming, and some of us intend to profit from the chaos." When Hawk awoke, he was tied to one of the support beams, his head throbbing like a blacksmith's anvil. The chamber was empty now, the crates and barrels gone, but he could hear voices and the sound of horses from somewhere above. Through the pain, his mind started piecing things together: the convenient robbery, Pete's firing, Fleming's sudden interest in outside help. It had all been a smokescreen, meant to keep local law enforcement looking the other way while something bigger played out. The rope around his wrists was tight, but they'd missed the small knife he kept in his boot. As he worked to free himself, Hawk's thoughts turned to old Pete. The bartender had been at the Painted Lady for decades, seeing everything, hearing everything. How much had he known? Was that why Fleming had really fired him? It took 10 minutes to saw through the ropes, another 5 to find his way out of the mine. The sun was setting again, painting the desert in shades of fire and blood. Fresh wagon tracks led away from the mine, heading west toward the territorial border. His mare was where he'd left her, stomping impatiently. "Easy, girl," he murmured, swinging into the saddle. "We got work to do." Hawk rode through the night, following the wagon trail by moonlight. Whatever was in those crates and barrels, whoever these men were working for, it was bigger than a simple saloon robbery. The pieces were there, like a half-finished puzzle: weapons, explosives, mysterious Eastern interests. Something was brewing, something that could tear the territory apart. Dawn found him at the edge of Apache land, where the wagon tracks disappeared into a maze of red rock canyons. He'd need help to pursue them further, help from the sheriff, maybe even the army. But first, he had another stop to make. Old Pete's small adobe house sat on the outskirts of town, a few scraggly chickens pecking in the yard. The old bartender was on his porch, nursing a cup of coffee, his bruises faded to yellowish green. "Figured you'd be back," Pete said as Hawk dismounted. "Reckon you found more than just stolen whiskey money out there." Hawk studied the old man's face. "How long you known about what Fleming was really up to?" "Long enough." Pete set his coffee cup down. "Man like me, behind a bar all those years, you hear things. See things. Fleming and his friends, they've been planning something big. Arms running is just the start of it. And that's why they wanted you gone." Pete nodded. "Can't have no witnesses with loose lips once the real show begins." "That robbery?" "Was just their way of cleaning house, so to speak." Hawk leaned against the porch rail, his tired muscles protesting. "Well then, reckon you and me need to have us a long talk." "And after that?" He looked west, toward the canyons where the wagon tracks had disappeared. "After that, we got some real work to do." Old Pete smiled, the expression making his bruised face look fiercer instead of friendly. "Been waiting 15 years to hear someone say that, Deputy. Them fellows think the West is dying, that they can carve it up and sell it off piece by piece. But they don't know this land like we do. Don't know its secrets." "No," Hawk agreed, his hand resting on his gun. "They surely don't." The morning wind kicked up, carrying with it the smell of sage and coming rain. Somewhere out in those canyons, men were moving weapons and making plans, thinking themselves clever and safe in their schemes. But they'd forgotten the first rule of the West: secrets out here were like rattlesnakes. Sooner or later, they always came out of hiding. And when they did, Hawk would be waiting. He took one last look at the rising sun, its light spreading across the land like molten gold. The West wasn't dying. It was changing, sure as seasons, but its heart, the wild, untamed spirit that had drawn men like him to it, that would never die. Not as long as there were still folks willing to fight for it. "Come on inside," Pete said, opening his door. "Got some coffee fresh made, and a story you need to hear about what Fleming and his friends have really been planning these past few years." Hawk followed the old bartender inside, his spurs jingling softly against the wooden porch boards. Whatever storm was coming, whatever plans those men had set in motion, they were about to learn another truth about the West, that sometimes the most dangerous predators weren't the ones that made the most noise, but the ones that watched, and waited, and knew when to strike. The door closed behind them, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the desert like God's own warning shot. The end. Join the adventure with the Western Echoes, Cowboy Tales Unleashed. If you're loving our cowboy stories and captivating tales, don't miss out. Hit that subscribe button to stay updated on all our future posts. Saddle up and ride along with us.